I need your ID now. Don't play smart. You people always think rules don't apply to you.
I am a federal prosecutor. You have no warrant.
You're
Step
on
back.
my street.
You
Show
women
us some
think you can
respect
talk your
before
way
we
out of
rough
this?
you up.
Cooperate.
This is my home. You are breaking the law.
Lies.
At 6:14 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Bethesda, Maryland, federal prosecutor Vanessa Achebe was loading her briefcase into the back seat of her car in her own driveway. She was 44 years old, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, heading to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., where she served as a senior trial attorney in the Civil Rights and Public Corruption Division. She had spent the last 16 years prosecuting dirty cops, abusive federal agents, and officials who believed their authority placed them above the law. Her conviction rate was one of the highest in the office. Her husband, Colonel Idris Achebe, was an Army JAG officer currently deployed overseas. Their two children, 9-year-old Naomi and 12-year-old Elijah, were still asleep inside the house. The street was quiet. Sprinklers clicked across a neighbor's lawn. A woman 3 doors down walked a golden retriever along the sidewalk. The houses were large, well-kept, set back from the road with mature trees and clean driveways. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happened. Vanessa placed her coffee on the roof of the car and checked her phone. She had a 9 a.m. briefing on a police misconduct case and 3 depositions later in the week. She didn't notice the black SUV turning onto her street. She didn't see the white van behind it. By the time she looked up, they were already parked, and the morning she had planned was already over. A black, unmarked Chevrolet Suburban and a white government van stopped 2 houses short of Vanessa's driveway. 4 men stepped out. The lead agent was Craig Burnham, 46, a supervisory detention and deportation officer with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He had been with ICE for 18 years, most of them spent running aggressive sweep operations across the D.C. metro area. His internal file held a pattern his supervisors had chosen to ignore. Sealed complaints for excessive force, warrantless entries, and a documented habit of targeting mixed-race households and immigrant-adjacent communities. None of it had ever resulted in discipline. His second was Agent Dale Fenton, 31, 5 years on the job, a man who had built his short career by mirroring Burnham's worst instincts without question. 2 junior agents stayed near the vehicles. Burnham held a printed photograph and a target address. The address belonged to a 62-year-old Guatemalan woman who had missed an immigration hearing after being hospitalized. She lived 3 streets away, but Burnham never verified the house number. He saw Vanessa, a black woman, standing in the driveway of a home he assumed matched his paperwork. He didn't cross-check. He didn't pause. He folded the paper into his vest pocket and started walking up the driveway. Burnham reached the top of the driveway and stopped 5 feet from Vanessa. His posture was wide, one hand resting on his belt, the other pointing directly at her. "I need you to identify yourself. Name and date of birth. Now." Vanessa set her phone down on the roof of the car beside her coffee. Her voice was calm. "Who are you, and why are you on my property?" Burnham flashed a credentials wallet in a quick motion, too fast to read the name or agency seal, then snapped it shut. "Federal Enforcement Operation. I need your identification immediately." Vanessa didn't move. "Do you have a warrant?" "We don't need a warrant," Burnham said. Vanessa looked at him, then at Fenton, who had moved to her right, positioning himself between her and the driver's side door. She turned back to Burnham. "I'm a senior trial attorney with the United States Attorney's Office, Civil Rights Division, and yes, you do need a warrant to be on my property demanding identification. So I'll ask again, do you have one?" Burnham's expression didn't change, but his jaw shifted slightly. "A lot of people claim to be a lot of things, ma'am. That doesn't change what's happening here. I need your name, and I need your cooperation. You're on private property without a warrant, without probable cause, and without my consent," Vanessa said. "I'm asking you to leave." Burnham didn't step back. He stepped closer. Fenton mirrored the movement from the side, his hand now resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. Neither of them had any intention of leaving. And Vanessa, who had spent her career standing across from men exactly like this in federal courtrooms, understood in that moment that what was happening on her driveway was no longer a conversation. It was a confrontation. Vanessa reached into the open back seat of her car and pulled her Department of Justice credentials from the outer pocket of her briefcase. She held them up, badge and photo ID visible. "I am a federal prosecutor. This is my home. You have no warrant, no probable cause, and no authority to be here." Burnham glanced at the credentials for less than a second. He didn't read the name. He didn't look at the photo. He looked back at her face. "Put your hands on the vehicle." Vanessa kept the credentials raised. "I'm not going to do that. You have no legal basis to detain me. I'm citing the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure. You are in violation of it right now." Fenton leaned toward Burnham and muttered, just loud enough for Vanessa to hear, "Those can be faked. You can buy those online." Vanessa's eyes moved to Fenton, then back to Burnham. "You're looking at an authenticated DOJ credential with a federal bar number. I suggest you verify it before you do something you cannot undo." Burnham closed the distance. His right hand shot forward and locked around Vanessa's left wrist. She didn't pull away. Her voice stayed level, but rose in volume. "You are assaulting a federal officer of the court on her own property without a warrant." He twisted her arm behind her back. Her shoulder torqued. She exhaled hard, but didn't scream. Across the street, a door opened. Howard Alston, 71, a retired federal appellate judge who had served 28 years on the bench, stepped onto his front porch. He raised his phone and began recording without a word. Next door, another door opened. Dominic Quarles, 53, a former Secret Service agent who had spent 20 years on presidential details, walked down his front steps and stopped at the edge of the driveway. His voice cut across the morning air. "Take your hands off that woman right now." Burnham didn't turn around. Fenton looked over his shoulder at the growing audience, but said nothing. And Vanessa, her arm pinned behind her back, her suit pulling at the shoulder seam, stood completely still. Not because she couldn't resist, but because she knew exactly what would happen to a black woman who fought back against federal agents in her own driveway. Burnham drove his weight forward and forced Vanessa down. Her knees hit the driveway first, then her hip, then her cheek against the cold pavement beside her own car. The fabric of her suit tore at the knee. Her briefcase fell from the back seat and landed open next to her. Fenton moved in and pressed his palm into her shoulder blade, pinning her flat. Burnham pulled her wrists together behind her back and snapped the cuffs on. The click echoed off the garage door. Vanessa did not struggle. She did not raise her voice. She spoke clearly, loud enough for every camera and every neighbor now standing on their lawns to hear. "My name is Vanessa Achebe. I am a senior trial attorney with the United States Attorney's Office, Civil Rights Division. My DOJ employee number is 77431. I do not consent to this detention. I do not consent to this search. I have not been shown a warrant." Near the vehicles at the curb, one of the junior agents had unfolded the operational paperwork and was scanning it with a flashlight. He looked at the house number on the mailbox, then back at the sheet. He walked quickly toward Fenton and said something low, close to his ear. "The address doesn't match. This isn't the target residence." Fenton glanced at the paper for half a second, then looked away. He said nothing. He kept his hand on Vanessa's shoulder. Burnham stood up and keyed his radio. "This is Unit 4. We have a non-compliant subject in custody at the location, requesting transport for processing." Vanessa turned her head against the pavement. "I am compliant. I am not resisting. You are making a mistake that will follow you for the rest of your career." Then the front door of the house opened. Naomi Achebe, 9 years old, barefoot in cotton pajamas, stepped onto the front porch. She saw her mother face down on the driveway, wrists cuffed behind her back, 2 men standing over her. She screamed. The sound cut through the entire street. Howard Alston's phone, still recording from across the road, caught every second of it. The child's cry, the mother on the ground, the agents who didn't even look up. Vanessa's voice broke through the stillness that followed her daughter's scream. "Do not enter my home. You do not have a warrant. I do not consent. Burnham ignored her. He looked at Fenton and gestured toward the front door. Secure the premises. Make sure no one else is inside. Fenton stepped over the threshold and pushed past Naomi, who was frozen on the porch, tears streaming down her face, one hand gripping the doorframe. The junior agent followed, his expression tight, his eyes already scanning the hallway as though he knew they shouldn't be there. Inside, the house was quiet except for the sound of footsteps on hardwood. Family photos lined the staircase wall, framed diplomas. A wedding portrait. Fenton moved into the kitchen and started opening drawers. The junior agent checked the living room, glancing at a bookshelf filled with legal texts and military histories. Then a voice came from the top of the stairs. Mom? Elijah Achebe, 12 years old, stood on the landing in a t-shirt and basketball shorts, eyes wide. Fenton pointed at him. Come down here. Sit on the floor. Hands where I can see them. Elijah descended slowly, lowered himself to the hallway floor, and placed his palms flat on the wood. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He stared straight ahead at the wall across from him, where his father's official army portrait hung in a polished frame. Colonel Idris Achebe in full dress uniform, ribbons across his chest, American flag behind his shoulder. Next to it hung a row of framed commendations. A photo of Vanessa shaking hands with a United States senator, another of her being sworn in by a federal judge, right hand raised, left hand on the Constitution. Fenton stopped in front of the wall. His eyes moved across the frames. The junior agent appeared beside him and whispered, We need to leave, right now. Fenton didn't answer. He turned and walked back toward the front door. Outside, Burnham stood over Vanessa, radio in hand, watching the neighbors multiply on their porches and lawns. He told her she would be transported to a federal processing facility. She turned her head and looked up at him with an expression that held no fear, only certainty. You're going to lose everything over this. Every badge, every pension, every year you put in. All of it. Gone. Burnham stared down at her, and for the first time since he had stepped onto that driveway, something behind his eyes shifted. Howard Alston had not stopped recording, but his other hand had already been busy. From his porch, phone braced against the railing, he had made 3 calls in under 4 minutes. The first went to Judge Eleanor Voss, a sitting federal judge on the D.C. Circuit who had served alongside Alston for 9 years before his retirement. The second went to the director of the ACLU's Washington office, a woman he had known for 2 decades. The third went to a senior investigative reporter at the Washington Post. To each of them, he said the same thing. ICE agents have a federal prosecutor in handcuffs in her own driveway. No warrant. Her children are inside. I'm recording everything. At the curb, Dominic Quarles had moved his body directly between the black SUV and the street, blocking any departure. He held his phone at chest level, recording steadily, narrating in a calm, trained voice. I am a retired United States Secret Service agent. I am witnessing what appears to be an unlawful detention of a civilian on her own property by federal agents who have not produced a warrant. There are 2 minor children inside the residence. Agents have entered the home without consent. 2 more neighbors stepped out. The first was a young woman named Sonia Pfeiffer, 29, a congressional staffer who worked for a member of the House Judiciary Committee. She stood on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, watching in silence, already composing a message to her office on her phone. The second was Renata Molina, 52, a practicing immigration attorney who had handled hundreds of removal cases. She walked directly up to Burnham. Officer, you are in violation of the 4th Amendment, 8 U.S.C. Section 1357, and ICE Directive 11072.1, regarding sensitive locations and warrantless operations. I am documenting every action you take from this point forward. Burnham looked at her. Ma'am, I need you to step back and disperse. Nobody moved. Not Alston on his porch. Not Quarles at the curb. Not Molina 3 feet from Burnham's face. Not Pfeiffer on the sidewalk. And 7 blocks away, inside the U.S. Attorney's office, Vanessa's desk phone had been ringing unanswered for 15 minutes. Her deputy checked the clock and picked up the internal line. The call came in at 7:02 a.m. Vanessa's deputy, a career prosecutor named Lionel St. Pierre, had tried her cell 3 times with no answer. She had never missed a morning check-in, not once in 6 years. He called the DOJ's Internal Security Division. Within 8 minutes, a security officer confirmed that no authorized federal operation had been scheduled in Vanessa's neighborhood that morning. No warrant had been issued with her name or address. No interagency coordination had been filed. By 7:14, the DOJ's Office of the Inspector General had been looped in. By 7:19, a senior DOJ official, whose name would never appear in any public report, picked up a secure line and called ICE headquarters directly. The message was 5 sentences long. You have one of our senior prosecutors in handcuffs in her own driveway. There is no warrant. There is no probable cause. Her children are inside the home. Explain immediately. The ICE field office scrambled. Calls overlapped. Supervisors who had approved Burnham's morning operation without reviewing his target file were now reading it for the first time. Burnham's cell phone rang. His supervisor's voice was tight. Release her. Now. Burnham kept his grip on the radio. She was non-compliant. The situation isn't, release her now and do not say another word. Do you understand me? Not one word. Burnham stared at the phone for a moment, then walked to where Vanessa still lay on the driveway. He knelt down and unlocked the cuffs without speaking. Then he spoke anyway. This could have gone differently if you just cooperated. Vanessa sat up slowly. Her wrists were bruised and red. Her knee was bleeding through the torn fabric of her suit. Her daughter was still crying inside the house. Her son was still sitting on the hallway floor with his hands flat in front of him. 38 minutes had passed since Burnham first walked up her driveway. She looked at him and said nothing. She didn't need to. Everything that was coming for him was already in motion, and every second of it had been recorded. Vanessa sat on the front steps of her own home with her children on either side of her. Naomi pressed into her mother's arm and would not let go. Her small fingers gripped the torn fabric of Vanessa's sleeve, squeezing as though letting go meant it would all happen again. Her face was swollen from crying. Elijah sat on the other side, silent, staring at the place on the curb where the black SUV had been parked. He hadn't spoken a word since Fenton told him to sit on the floor of his own hallway. His hands still rested flat on his knees, palms down, exactly the way he had been ordered to hold them. He was 12 years old, and he had not moved them since. Vanessa's wrists were red and bruised where the cuffs had bitten into her skin. Her right knee bled slowly through the torn charcoal fabric of her suit. Her briefcase still lay open on the driveway where it had fallen. Howard Alston crossed the street carrying a glass of water. He sat down beside her without asking and handed it over. His voice was low. I have 14 minutes of footage, Vanessa. Every second. From the moment he touched you to the moment he took the cuffs off. Dominic Quarles walked up the driveway, phone still in hand. I have it from the street angle, full audio. They entered your home without consent, without a warrant, and without exigent circumstances. Renata Molina appeared beside him and handed Vanessa a single sheet of paper. It was a handwritten summary of every legal violation she had observed, organized by statute, time-stamped from memory. Vanessa looked at it, folded it carefully, and placed it in her jacket pocket. By 8 a.m., she had spoken with the Inspector General's office by phone, retained outside counsel through a former colleague at a civil rights firm, and emailed her supervisor a preliminary incident report with 5 attachments. She did not go to work that day. She drove her children to their pediatrician and requested trauma screening for both of them. Naomi held her arm the entire way. Elijah sat in the back seat and said nothing. By noon, the Department of Justice Inspector General had opened a formal investigation into the conduct of ICE agents at the Achebe residence. The Department of Homeland Security's Office of Professional Responsibility was notified and assigned a parallel review. ICE's Office of Principal Legal Advisor received a federal preservation order covering all body camera footage, GPS vehicle tracking logs, radio transmissions, operational planning documents, and the target file Burnham's unit had used that morning. The operational file was damning before anyone even reached the footage. The target was a 62-year-old Guatemalan grandmother named Lucia Estrada Vélez, who had missed a scheduled immigration hearing 3 months earlier because she had been hospitalized for a cardiac episode. Her address was listed clearly on every page of the file. It was 3 blocks from Vanessa's home. A different street, a different house number. Vanessa's name, address, and photograph appeared nowhere in any document. Burnham had gone to the wrong house and had never checked. Federal investigators then pulled Burnham's body camera records. His camera had not been activated during the operation. A review of his equipment history revealed that his body camera had failed to record during 7 of his prior complaints, every single one involving allegations of excessive force or racial targeting. The pattern was no longer deniable. But the 2 junior agents assigned to the operation had activated their cameras when they exited the van. Their footage captured everything. The approach, the demand for identification, Vanessa holding up her DOJ credentials, Burnham grabbing her wrist, the takedown on the driveway, Fenton pinning her shoulder to the pavement, the cuffs snapping shut, the front door opening, Naomi stepping out in her pajamas, the scream, the agents pushing past a crying child to enter a home they had no legal right to be inside. A 12-year-old boy ordered to sit on the floor of his own hallway with his hands visible. The footage was 22 minutes long, and every frame of it was now in federal hands. Federal investigators pulled Craig Burnham's full personnel file within 48 hours. What they found was not a single lapse in judgment. It was a pattern that stretched across nearly 2 decades. 14 formal complaints had been filed against Burnham during his career with ICE. The allegations were consistent: excessive force, racial targeting, warrantless entries into private residences, verbal intimidation of subjects and their families. 6 of those complaints had been filed by immigration attorneys representing clients Burnham had detained. 3 came from community advocacy organizations documenting patterns in his unit's operations. 2 had been filed by other federal employees who witnessed his conduct during joint operations and found it alarming enough to put on record. Every single complaint had been administratively closed without discipline. Not one resulted in a suspension, a reprimand, or even a formal counseling session. Fenton's file was thinner, but told the same story from a different angle. In every operation where a complaint had been filed against Burnham, Fenton had been present. His behavior mirrored Burnham's precisely. The same language, the same posture, the same refusal to de-escalate. He had never once intervened, questioned an order, or filed an internal concern. Then the emails surfaced. An internal correspondence chain between Burnham's field supervisor and a regional operations director included a message dated 14 months before the Achebe incident. The supervisor described Burnham as aggressive but effective, gets numbers, doesn't leave empty-handed. The message made clear what ICE leadership had valued: arrest statistics, closure rates, not constitutional compliance, not civil rights, not the law Burnham had sworn to uphold. Investigators interviewed the junior agent who had flagged the wrong address on the morning of the arrest. His statement was direct. He told them he had checked the operational paperwork against the house number while Burnham was detaining Vanessa. He walked to Fenton and told him the address did not match. Fenton's response, captured on the junior agent's own body camera audio, was 4 words: "Shut up and hold the perimeter." The junior agent returned to the van. He did not intervene further, but he also did not turn off his camera. Howard Alston provided his 14 minutes of footage to the Washington Post the following evening. The paper published its story the next morning under a front-page headline that would be read in every newsroom, congressional office, and federal agency in Washington. ICE agents arrest Black Federal Prosecutor in her own driveway without a warrant. The footage went online at the same time. Within 6 hours, it had been viewed more than 2 million times. Cable networks ran segments on loop throughout the day, cycling between Alston's porch footage, Dominic Quarles' street-level recording, and stills pulled from the junior agent's body cameras that had been entered into the federal record. One image dominated everything. Naomi Achebe, 9 years old, barefoot in cotton pajamas, standing in the doorway of her own home, mouth open, screaming, while her mother lay face down on the driveway, in handcuffs 10 feet away. That image was shared across every platform, reprinted in every major newspaper, and projected on screens during 3 separate cable news panels before the end of the first day. It became a symbol that no official statement could contain. Civil rights organizations filed amicus briefs supporting the federal investigation and demanding expanded oversight of ICE field operations. The Congressional Black Caucus issued a formal statement calling for immediate congressional hearings. 3 sitting senators sent a joint letter to the Secretary of Homeland Security demanding Burnham's termination, Fenton's termination, and a full operational audit of Burnham's unit going back 5 years. ICE headquarters released a statement 36 hours after the story broke. It called the incident an operational error currently under review and expressed the agency's commitment to professional standards and accountability. The public response was immediate and furious. Operational error did not explain a man grabbing a federal prosecutor on her own property. It did not explain cuffs on a woman who had shown her DOJ credentials. It did not explain agents entering a home without a warrant and ordering a 12-year-old boy to sit on the floor. And it did not explain the sound of a 9-year-old girl screaming on camera while 4 grown men stood over her mother and did nothing. The phrase operational error trended online for 2 days, not as a defense, as an indictment. A federal grand jury convened 6 weeks after the incident and returned indictments against both agents. Craig Burnham was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, unlawful entry of a private residence, assault on a federal official, and filing a false operational report. The false report charge stemmed from Burnham's post-incident documentation in which he described Vanessa as a non-compliant subject who refused to identify herself and exhibited hostile and evasive behavior. Every word of it was contradicted by 3 separate video recordings and the testimony of 6 civilian witnesses. Dale Fenton was indicted on the same charges minus the false report, with an additional count of conspiracy to deprive civil rights. Prosecutors argued that Fenton had received direct information from the junior agent that the address was wrong, had ignored it, and had continued participating in an unlawful detention and warrantless entry with full knowledge that no legal basis existed for either. The 2 junior agents cooperated fully with federal investigators from the first interview. Neither was charged. One had provided the body camera footage voluntarily before being asked. The other had given a written statement confirming the address discrepancy and Fenton's instruction to shut up and hold the perimeter. Burnham's field supervisor was referred for administrative action on charges of failure to supervise and enabling a documented pattern of civil rights abuse through sustained inaction on complaints. He was not criminally charged, but was stripped of his supervisory role and placed on unpaid leave pending a disciplinary board review. Within the same month, Burnham was terminated from ICE. Fenton was terminated the following week. 3 additional supervisors in the D.C. field office were disciplined for their roles in the systemic mishandling of prior complaints. 1 was forced into early retirement. 2 were demoted and reassigned to administrative positions with no operational authority. The D.C. field office of ICE was placed under a federal consent decree requiring independent oversight of all future enforcement operations, warrant verification protocols, and mandatory review of any complaint involving allegations of racial targeting or excessive force. The consent decree would remain in effect for a minimum of 5 years. The office that had once described Burnham as aggressive but effective was now answering to a federal monitor who would review every operation before it left the building. The trial of Craig Burnham began on a Monday in the E. Barrett Prettyman United States Courthouse in Washington, D.C. It lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution's case was built around 22 minutes of body camera footage recorded by the 2 junior agents. The jury watched it in full on the first day. They saw Burnham approach Vanessa in her driveway. They heard her identify herself calmly as a federal prosecutor. They watched her hold up her DOJ credentials. They saw Burnham glance at them for less than a second and order her to put her hands on the vehicle. They watched him grab her wrist. They watched him twist her arm behind her back and force her to the pavement beside her own car. They heard the sound of her knees striking the concrete. They saw Fenton press her shoulder flat to the ground. They heard the cuffs click. They heard Vanessa recite her name, her title, her employee number, and her refusal to consent, all while face down on her own driveway. And then they heard the front door open. They saw Naomi step out, and they heard the scream. Several jurors looked away. One pressed a hand to her mouth. The footage continued. Fenton pushing past the child. Elijah ordered to the floor. Agents opening drawers in a home they had no warrant to enter. The wall of photographs and commendations that told them exactly whose house they were standing in. Use of force experts testified over 3 days that there was zero legal or tactical justification for any physical contact with Vanessa. She had identified herself, she had presented credentials, she had not made any threatening movement. Constitutional law professors walked the jury through the Fourth Amendment violations point by point. Warrantless seizure of a person, warrantless entry into a home, absence of probable cause, absence of exigent circumstances. Vanessa testified on the 9th day. She was precise, composed, and unshakable under cross-examination. She described the stop, the demands, the grab, the takedown, the cuffs, the sound of her daughter's voice. She did not raise her voice once. Burnham's defense argued he had been following standard operational protocols and had made a good-faith mistake based on the information available to him. The prosecution dismantled this in closing by displaying the operational file side by side with Vanessa's actual address. The numbers were not close. They were not even on the same street. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on every count. Burnham stood motionless as the verdicts were read. Fenton, who had pleaded guilty 2 weeks before the trial in exchange for a reduced sentence, sat in a separate courtroom awaiting his own sentencing. Burnham received 5 years and 4 months in federal prison. Fenton received 2 years and 8 months. The judge, before closing the proceedings, spoke directly from the bench. The Constitution does not have an exception for expediency. It does not have a carve-out for haste, for assumption, or for the arrogance of men who believe a badge exempts them from the law. You terrorized a family in their home because you could not be bothered to check an address. And when you were told you had the wrong house, you did not stop. That is not an error. That is a choice. And today, that choice has consequences. Vanessa filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against ICE, the Department of Homeland Security, Craig Burnham, and Dale Fenton. The complaint cited unlawful detention, excessive force, warrantless entry, assault on a federal official, and intentional infliction of emotional distress on 2 minor children. The evidence was so overwhelming that settlement negotiations lasted less than 3 weeks. The case settled for $4.2 million and sweeping institutional reforms. Mandatory warrant verification protocols requiring agents to confirm target addresses against 2 independent sources before any enforcement action. GPS address confirmation for all operations. Body camera activation as a non-negotiable condition of employment, with automatic termination for any agent who deactivated or failed to record during an operation. And an independent civilian review board with full authority over complaints involving racial profiling or excessive force, reporting directly to the DHS Inspector General and bypassing the chain of command that had protected Burnham for 18 years. Colonel Idris Achebe returned from deployment 5 weeks after the trial. He stood beside his wife at a press conference on the courthouse steps, in full dress uniform, their children between them. He did not speak. He did not need to. Vanessa returned to the U.S. Attorney's Office and was promoted to Chief of the Civil Rights Division. She established a legal defense fund for families targeted by unlawful immigration enforcement. It took on 30 cases in its first 6 months. Naomi Achebe, in a 4th-grade essay, wrote 7 sentences that were viewed more than 4 million times. The last line read, "My mom fights for the Constitution every day. One morning, she had to fight for it in our own driveway." Weeks later, Vanessa walked into the federal courthouse carrying the same briefcase that had fallen open on her driveway that morning. Nothing about her stride had changed. The only difference was that now, when she told a jury no one is above the law, she carried the proof in the scars on her wrists. This case was brutal, but the case on the right spirals completely out of control.
You don't belong here. Show me ID now.
Stand on my own property. I'm a retired police chief. Do you have a warrant?
Don't play smart with me. You think just because you're black and in a robe I won't take action? Hands where I can see you.
Identification, now! Don't make this worse!
At 6:40 a.m. on a quiet Wednesday morning in Crestwood, Georgia, dew still sat on the lawns of Maple Ridge Drive. The street was calm, lined with manicured hedges, 2-car garages, and American flags hanging from porches that had never seen trouble. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their driveways and left packages on doorsteps without worry. Predominantly white, upper middle class, and safe in every way the word was supposed to mean. Clarence Dupree, 62 years old, stepped out his front door in slippers and a terry cloth robe, coffee in one hand, heading for the newspaper at the end of the driveway. Through the front window behind him, a row of framed commendation plaques from the Ridgefield Police Department were visible on the wall, each one marking a chapter of a career that had spanned more than 3 decades. Clarence had started as a patrol officer at 25, walking beats in neighborhoods no one else wanted. He worked narcotics, led a tactical unit, made sergeant, then lieutenant, then captain. At 52, the city appointed him chief of police, the first black man to hold the position in Ridgefield's 140-year history. He served for 7 years, oversaw department reforms, reduced use of force complaints by 40%, and retired with full honors. The governor had sent a letter. His officers had lined the street the day he walked out for the last time. Now, 3 years into retirement, Clarence spent his mornings in the garden, walked his dog along the creek behind the house, and read the paper on the porch before his wife woke up. His neighbors respected him. They knew his name. They knew what he had given. He bent down and picked up the newspaper, tucked it under his arm, and turned back toward the porch. That was when 2 black Chevrolet Suburbans turned onto Maple Ridge Drive. They moved slowly, almost deliberately, the tinted windows catching the early light. They stopped in front of Clarence's house. 4 men stepped out. All wore tactical vests with the letters ICE printed across the chest. The lead agent was Victor Stelling, 44 years old, 16 years with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Stelling had built his reputation on aggressive field operations, the kind that generated numbers for quarterly reports and complaints from immigration advocacy organizations in equal measure. His file contained 9 formal complaints over the past 6 years, ranging from unlawful entry to excessive force during detentions. None had resulted in discipline. He had learned, like so many before him, that the system would absorb the complaints and keep him on the street. His partner was Kyle Fenton, 31, 5 years on the job, a younger agent who had attached himself to Stelling early and never let go. Fenton mimicked Stelling's language, copied his approach, laughed at the same jokes, and never once questioned a decision in the field. 2 additional agents stayed near the vehicles, hands on their belts, scanning the quiet street like they had rolled into a threat zone. They were supposed to be looking for an undocumented immigrant connected to a residence 3 blocks east. The address didn't match. The name didn't match. Nothing about Clarence Dupree's home had any connection to their operation. But Stelling had spotted something from behind the windshield as they passed. A black man standing in the driveway of a house that, in his judgment, didn't seem to belong to someone who looked like that. He didn't check the file. He didn't confirm the address. He didn't radio dispatch. He just pulled over, stepped out, and started walking toward Clarence with the kind of certainty that only comes from years of never being held accountable. Fenton followed a step behind, right hand resting on his belt. Clarence looked up from his driveway, newspaper under one arm, coffee still warm in his hand, and saw 4 federal agents approaching his front lawn. His posture straightened, not out of fear, but out of recognition. After 34 years in law enforcement, he knew exactly what he was looking at. And he knew, with the instinct of a man who had spent his life on the other side of the badge, that what was about to happen had nothing to do with any warrant. Stelling closed the distance fast, stopping 3 feet from Clarence with the kind of proximity that wasn't professional. It was territorial. He looked Clarence up and down, eyes moving over the bathrobe, the slippers, the newspaper. "I need to see some identification." His voice wasn't a request. It was a command, wrapped in the assumption that it would be obeyed without question. Clarence didn't flinch. He had heard that tone thousands of times across 34 years, had trained officers to never use it unless the situation demanded it. This situation didn't. He kept his hands visible, coffee still in one, newspaper tucked under the other arm. "Good morning. What's this about?" Stelling's jaw tightened. "I said I need identification. Now." Fenton moved to Clarence's right side, cutting off the path to the front door. His hand stayed near his belt. Clarence noted the positioning instinctively. A flank. He had taught that formation himself to patrol teams. 2 points of control on a single subject. Standard for a threat. Absurd for a man in slippers holding a newspaper. "I'm a retired law enforcement officer," Clarence said, his voice steady and clear. "Retired Chief of Police, Ridgefield PD. I've lived at this address for 11 years. Do you have a warrant?" Stelling didn't answer the question. He didn't acknowledge the career. He didn't ask for clarification. He looked at Clarence the way he had looked at dozens of people before him, people whose answers didn't matter because the decision had already been made. "Put your hands where I can see them. Both of them." Clarence lowered the newspaper slowly. "I'm standing on my own property in a bathrobe. I've identified myself verbally. I'm asking again, do you have a warrant for this address?" Stelling stepped closer. Close enough that Clarence could smell the coffee on his breath. "We'll determine whose property this is." Across the street, a curtain shifted. 2 houses down, a garage door that had been halfway open stopped moving. A woman in a second-floor window pressed her face closer to the glass. Maple Ridge Drive was waking up, and what it was waking up to was something it had never seen before. Clarence kept his voice calm. "My ID is inside the house. I'm happy to go get it." He turned slightly toward the front door. Stelling moved into his path, chest forward, blocking the walkway completely. "Nobody is going inside." Clarence stopped. He didn't step back, but he didn't push forward. He understood what was happening. He had seen it from the other side enough times to know. The moment an officer decides the subject isn't getting the benefit of the doubt, every option closes. You go for your ID, you're making a sudden move. You stand still, you're being uncooperative. You ask questions, you're being combative. There is no right answer, because the answer was never the point. "I am not resisting," Clarence said. His voice was louder now, not aggressive, but deliberate, projected. The voice of a man who knew that witnesses mattered. "I am a retired police chief. I am unarmed. I am on my own property." Stelling's mouth curved slightly. "Sure you are." He turned to Fenton. "Cuff him." Fenton moved immediately. His hand locked around Clarence's left wrist and pulled it behind his back. Clarence didn't resist. He kept his body loose, his feet planted. "Do you have a warrant for this address?" he asked again. No one answered. Stelling stepped forward and drove his palm into Clarence's upper back, shoving him against the side of his own truck parked in the driveway. The impact was hard enough to knock the air from his chest. His bathrobe tore at the shoulder seam. The coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered on the concrete, brown liquid spreading across the driveway in a slow, dark stain. Fenton wrenched both arms back and snapped the cuffs on, ratcheting them 2 clicks tighter than necessary. Clarence's cheek pressed against the cold metal of the truck bed. His breath fogged against the surface. From where his face rested, he could see his front porch. The American flag hung still in the windless morning. The commendation plaques were just visible through the window, and somewhere behind him, the 2 men who had put him in cuffs hadn't once looked at a warrant, checked an address, or confirmed a name. Because none of that had ever been the point. The first door to open was Ruth Engelman's. She was 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had lived next door to Clarence for 20 years. She had watched him build the garden bed along the fence line. She had brought over pie the week he moved in and had never stopped. She stepped onto her porch in a housecoat, one hand on the railing, and saw Clarence Dupree face down against the side of his own truck, hands cuffed behind his back, bathrobe torn, surrounded by men in tactical vests. Her voice carried across the yard like a bell. "That's Chief Dupree! What are you doing to him? He lives here!" Stelling didn't turn. Fenton glanced over his shoulder. "Ma'am, go back inside." "I will not go back inside. That man is my neighbor. He's a retired police chief. You have no business putting your hands on him." Across the street, a front door opened. Donald Pratt, 64, a white retired firefighter with 30 years on the job, stepped out with his phone already raised and recording. He didn't say a word at first. He just aimed the camera and started walking closer. "What are your badge numbers?" Donald asked. His voice was flat, direct, the tone of a man used to emergencies. Stelling turned now. "Sir, I need you to step back and go inside. This is a federal operation." Donald didn't move. "I asked for your badge numbers. You're detaining a man on his own property. I have a right to record this." Stelling's jaw clenched. "If you interfere with a federal operation, I will charge you with obstruction." "Try it," Donald said. "I'm standing on a public sidewalk. 2 houses down, a young couple, Liam and Sophia Garrett, appeared in their upstairs window, phone pressed against the glass, recording from an elevated angle that captured the full scene. The driveway, the SUVs, the agents, Clarence's torn robe, the shattered mug. Another neighbor opened a garage door. A woman on the corner stopped mid-jog and pulled out her phone. Fenton looked at the growing audience and leaned toward one of the backup agents near the vehicles. "Keep the civilians back." The agent stepped forward but stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, unsure of how far his authority reached on a residential street where no crime had been committed. Ruth hadn't moved. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching with the kind of fury that comes from witnessing something you know is wrong and refusing to look away. At least 5 phones were recording now. The entire cul-de-sac had become a witness. And not one of those cameras showed a warrant, a file, or a single legitimate reason for what was happening in Clarence Dupree's driveway. Stelling opened the rear door of the lead Suburban and guided Clarence inside with a hand on the back of his head. No explanation was given, no Miranda rights were read, no paperwork was shown. Clarence sat in silence, hands cuffed behind him, the torn bathrobe hanging open, slippers still on his feet. The seat smelled like disinfectant and sweat. The partition between the back and front was solid, no handle on the inside. He had sat on the other side of that partition for decades. He knew exactly what it meant to be behind it. The SUV pulled away from Maple Ridge Drive while Ruth still stood on her porch and Donald still held his phone in the air. Fenton rode in the passenger seat. Stelling drove. Neither spoke to Clarence. Neither acknowledged that the man in the back had told them 4 times who he was, had asked 3 times for a warrant, and had not once raised his voice or moved his hands. The drive took 40 minutes. The regional ICE processing facility was a gray concrete building behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Clarence was walked through a side entrance, past a metal detector, into a fluorescent-lit processing area where he was photographed against a white wall, fingerprinted on a digital scanner, and handed a clear plastic bag for his personal belongings. He had nothing to put in it. He had been taken from his driveway before he could grab his wallet, his phone, or his dignity. He was placed in a holding room with a metal bench bolted to the wall and a camera in the ceiling corner. The door locked behind him. When the intake officer ran his information and Clarence again stated clearly that he was a United States citizen and a retired chief of police, the officer paused. He looked at the screen, then at Clarence, then back at the screen. Something in his expression shifted. He stepped out of the room. Stelling was waiting in the corridor. The intake officer said something Clarence couldn't hear. Stelling's response carried through the door. "Process him like anyone else. We'll sort it out." Clarence sat on the metal bench, back straight, wrists raw from the cuffs that had only just been removed. He asked for a phone call. He was told it would be arranged. 2 hours passed before anyone came back. 2 hours in a locked room in slippers and a torn robe, with no charges, no explanation, and no record of why he was there. When the phone was finally placed in front of him, Clarence dialed the one number he knew would turn a local mistake into a federal reckoning. Clarence dialed his son's number from memory. Nathaniel Dupree, 36, was an Army JAG attorney stationed at Fort Liberty. He had spent the last decade in military law, handling cases that required precision, patience, and an understanding of how systems worked and how they failed. When his phone rang at 9:14 a.m. and he heard his father's voice, steady but stripped of its usual warmth, the patience disappeared. Nathaniel listened for 90 seconds. Then he hung up and went to work. His first call was to the ICE Regional Field Office. He identified himself as Captain Nathaniel Dupree, U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, and demanded his father's immediate release. He was told the matter was under review. "Under review," Nathaniel repeated. "You detained a 62-year-old U.S. citizen with no warrant at an address that isn't connected to any active operation. What exactly is under review?" The line went to hold. Nathaniel didn't wait. His next call went to the Ridgefield Police Department, where his father had served for 34 years. Officers who had worked under Clarence still walked those halls. The name Dupree still carried weight there. Word moved fast. Within the hour, Yvonne Saunders, Clarence's former deputy chief and now acting chief of the department, picked up her phone and called ICE directly. She confirmed Clarence's full name, date of birth, citizenship, address, rank, and career history. She was told they were verifying the information. Saunders' voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You arrested a 34-year law enforcement veteran in his bathrobe in his own driveway with no warrant. What exactly are you verifying?" There was silence on the other end. Saunders continued, "I'm going to give you my direct number, and then I'm going to call the Department of Justice. You have 1 hour to make this right before it stops being a phone call and becomes a federal incident." Donald Pratt uploaded the video at 8:47 a.m. He didn't add a caption. He didn't need to. The footage spoke in a language that needed no explanation. It showed the full arrest from the sidewalk, Stelling's aggressive approach, Clarence's calm compliance, the demand for identification, the refusal to answer questions about a warrant, the shove against the truck, the torn bathrobe, the coffee mug shattering on the concrete. Ruth Engelman's voice cutting across the yard. "That's Chief Dupree! What are you doing to him?" By noon, the video had 200,000 views. By evening, it had crossed 2 million. Local news stations ran it first, then national outlets picked it up. The headline wrote itself, and every network ran some version of the same words. ICE agents arrest retired black police chief in his own driveway. No warrant, no cause. The comments came in waves. Veterans groups issued statements. Police associations called it a disgrace to the badge. Civil rights organizations demanded an investigation. Retired officers from departments across the country shared the video with one line: "That could have been any of us." The Garrett couple's footage from the upstairs window added a second angle, wider, showing the full cul-de-sac, the SUVs, the backup agents standing uselessly by the vehicles, while a 62-year-old man in slippers was cuffed on his own property. That footage was reposted by accounts with millions of followers. The optics were devastating, and they were undeniable. A decorated black law enforcement leader who had spent his life protecting his community, treated like a fugitive in front of his neighbors, on a lawn he had mowed for 11 years, beneath a flag he had earned the right to fly, and every second of it had been captured by the people who knew him best. By midday, the video had reached the desks that mattered. ICE leadership in Washington was briefed. The regional field office director pulled the operational file for Stelling's unit, and within minutes confirmed what Clarence had said from the beginning. There was no warrant for his address. There had never been one. The target of the operation was a residence 3 blocks east on a different street with a different house number. Stelling had never verified the address before stepping out of the vehicle. He had never cross-referenced the file. He had never contacted dispatch. He had seen a black man in a nice neighborhood and made a decision that bypassed every protocol his training was supposed to enforce. An internal review of Stelling's record surfaced a memo that should have ended the conversation years ago. He had been flagged twice before, once for conducting an enforcement operation at an incorrect address in Gwinnett County, where agents entered the wrong home and detained a legal resident for 4 hours. Once for excessive force during a routine detention in Cobb County, where a complaint described Stelling shoving a handcuffed man into the side of a vehicle hard enough to crack a rib. Both complaints had been filed. Both had been reviewed. Both had been closed with no discipline, no retraining, no consequence. The system had looked at Victor Stelling twice and decided he was not a problem. Now the system was watching a video with 6 million views that proved otherwise. The regional director ordered Clarence's immediate release. No formal charges had ever been filed. No probable cause had ever existed. Clarence was driven back to Crestwood in the same SUV that had taken him. The ride was silent. No apology was offered. When the vehicle turned onto Maple Ridge Drive nearly 7 hours after he had been taken from it, the street looked nothing like it had that morning. News vans lined the curb. Cameras were already rolling. Clarence stepped out of the SUV in the same torn bathrobe and slippers he had been wearing when they took him. The cameras caught everything. The raw marks on his wrists, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he paused for a moment on his own driveway and looked at the spot where his coffee mug had shattered that morning, the stain still visible on the concrete. Ruth Engelman reached him first. She crossed the lawn without a word and wrapped her arms around him. She held on for a long time. Donald Pratt was next. He extended his hand and Clarence took it. Donald nodded once. The look between them said more than any statement could. A reporter stepped forward. "Chief Dupree, do you have anything to say?" Clarence looked at the camera. His voice was steady, but thinner than it had been that morning, worn down by 7 hours of concrete walls and fluorescent lights, and silence. "I gave 34 years to law enforcement. I believed in the badge. I dedicated my life to what it was supposed to stand for. Today, that badge was used against me because of the color of my skin, on my own property, in front of my neighbors, without a warrant or a reason." He paused. "That's not law enforcement. That's something else." Inside the house, his wife Evelyn Dupree, 60, a retired school principal, sat at the kitchen table with her hands trembling around a glass of water she hadn't touched. She had watched the arrest from the bedroom window that morning. She had seen the agents grab him, shove him, cuff him against his own truck. She had wanted to run outside, but she was terrified that if she did, if she moved too fast or spoke too loud, they would put their hands on her too. Or worse, they would use her presence as an excuse to escalate. So she stood behind the glass and watched them take her husband. When Clarence sat down beside her, she looked at him with eyes that hadn't stopped crying for hours. "I watched them take you, and I couldn't breathe. I kept thinking, what if Nathaniel hadn't been a lawyer? What if no one had been filming?" Clarence took her hand but didn't answer, because they both knew the answer already. Nathaniel Dupree filed the formal complaint with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division before his father had even made it home. The document was precise, detailed, and built the way only a military attorney with something personal at stake could build it. Unlawful detention, warrantless arrest, excessive force, racial profiling, Fourth Amendment violations. Every claim supported by witness testimony, neighbor video from multiple angles, and the timeline of an operation that had no legal basis from the moment the SUVs turned onto Maple Ridge Drive. The DOJ opened an investigation within 48 hours. The case was assigned to a senior civil rights prosecutor who had handled federal law enforcement misconduct cases for over a decade. Simultaneously, the Congressional Black Caucus issued a public statement demanding full accountability and transparency from ICE leadership. A senior senator on the Judiciary Committee called for formal hearings on ICE field operation protocols, citing the arrest as evidence of systemic failure. The DHS Inspector General opened a parallel investigation into Stelling's unit, its operational history, and the supervisory chain that had allowed 9 prior complaints to disappear into filing cabinets. Internal records were subpoenaed, and then the body camera footage arrived. Stelling and Fenton had not been wearing body cameras during the arrest, a direct violation of agency policy. But the 2 backup agents near the vehicles had theirs activated. The footage was recovered from the agency server and reviewed frame by frame. It confirmed everything the neighbors had recorded, and more. Clarence was compliant from the first moment. He identified himself clearly, multiple times. He never raised his voice. He never moved aggressively. He asked for a warrant 3 times and received no answer. The footage showed Stelling initiating physical contact without provocation, and Fenton applying cuffs to a man who had done nothing but stand in his own driveway. Federal investigators watched the footage in a closed briefing room. No one in that room needed to watch it twice. The investigation moved fast because the evidence didn't require interpretation. It required a shovel. The deeper investigators dug into Stelling's unit, the worse it got. Operational records showed a pattern that was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Over the past 4 years, Stelling's team had conducted 86 field operations in predominantly white neighborhoods across the greater Atlanta metro area. In 61 of those operations, the individuals stopped, detained, or questioned were Black or Latino residents who had no connection to any active immigration case. They were homeowners, renters, commuters, people walking dogs or checking mailboxes, or sitting in parked cars in neighborhoods where someone decided they didn't belong. Complaints from 14 prior incidents were pulled from internal files. Every single one involved a person of color. Every single one had been dismissed internally with language that read like a template. Officer acted within operational discretion. Insufficient evidence to support claim. No further action recommended. Fenton's records added another layer. Investigators found that on 3 prior operations, he had written after-action reports containing fabricated details designed to retroactively justify warrantless stops. In one report, he described a subject as evasive and non-compliant. Witness statements from that same stop described the subject as cooperative and confused. The lies had never been questioned because no one had ever looked. Then came the testimony that broke the case open. A junior agent in Stelling's unit named Omar Bashir requested a meeting with federal investigators. Bashir, 28, had been with ICE for 3 years and assigned to Stelling's team for the last 18 months. He described a culture of racial targeting that operated on instinct rather than evidence. Stelling routinely told his team to trust your gut about who looks like they belong in certain neighborhoods. Bashir said he had filed an internal complaint 6 months before the Dupree arrest, describing the pattern in writing and naming specific incidents. The complaint was received, logged, and never acted on. No one had followed up. No one had interviewed him. No one had reviewed the operations he cited. The system had been told exactly what was happening inside Stelling's unit. It chose not to listen. The outcomes came swiftly because the evidence left no room for delay. Victor Stelling was terminated from Immigration and Customs Enforcement for gross misconduct, violation of Fourth Amendment protections, racial profiling, failure to verify operational targets, and failure to wear a body camera during a field operation. His federal law enforcement certification was revoked. He was referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution on charges of unlawful arrest and deprivation of rights under color of law. The man who had spent 16 years operating on instinct instead of evidence would now face a system that required both. Kyle Fenton was terminated for participation in an unlawful arrest, failure to intervene during the use of excessive force, falsifying details in 3 prior operational reports, and failure to activate his body camera. His certification was suspended pending further review, effectively ending any future in federal law enforcement. The agent who had spent 5 years following without questioning learned that silence carried its own conviction. The regional field office director, who had overseen a system that absorbed 9 complaints against Stelling without consequence, was forced into early retirement. 2 direct supervisors within the unit were demoted and reassigned. The unit itself was disbanded and placed under new leadership with a restructured chain of command. ICE issued a rare public statement acknowledging that the arrest of Clarence Dupree was unlawful and expressing what they called deep regret over the incident and its impact. The statement was carefully worded. It acknowledged the failure, it referenced the reforms being implemented, but it stopped short of a direct apology to Clarence or his family. Reporters noticed, the public noticed, and Clarence, sitting in his living room watching the statement air on the evening news, noticed most of all. "Regret is what you feel when you spill coffee," he said quietly to Evelyn, "not when you drag a man off his own property in handcuffs." Clarence filed the federal civil rights lawsuit 3 weeks later. The case was brought against ICE, Victor Stelling, Kyle Fenton, and the Department of Homeland Security. It cited unlawful arrest, excessive force, Fourth Amendment violations, racial profiling, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Evelyn Dupree was named as a co-plaintiff for the emotional damages she suffered, watching her husband be detained from their bedroom window, unable to intervene, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but stand behind glass while the people who were supposed to protect them put her husband in cuffs. The evidence was overwhelming. Neighbor videos from 5 angles, body camera footage from the 2 backup agents, internal operational records showing the wrong address, Stelling's 9 prior complaints, Fenton's falsified reports, Omar Bashir's whistleblower testimony, and the internal memo that proved the agency had been warned about Stelling twice and chose to do nothing. The case never made it to trial. The government settled for a multi-million-dollar amount that legal analysts described as one of the largest individual payouts in a federal civil rights case involving ICE. But the money was only part of it. As part of the settlement, the Department of Homeland Security agreed to mandatory warrant verification protocols, requiring field confirmation of target addresses before any engagement, required body camera activation for all field operations, with zero-tolerance enforcement for non-compliance, independent civilian review of all complaints involving racial profiling or discriminatory conduct, and a complete redesign of implicit bias training developed in partnership with civil rights organizations. Clarence donated a significant portion of the settlement to establish a legal defense fund for citizens wrongfully detained by federal agents, people who didn't have a son in the JAG Corps, neighbors with cameras, or a career that demanded recognition. People who had no one to call. Now they would. Weeks later, Clarence Dupree sat on his front porch at 6:40 in the morning. Same slippers, same robe, new coffee mug. The newspaper was tucked under his arm. The garden along the fence line was freshly tended, the beds he had planted the spring before now in full bloom. The American flag hung from the same hook it had always hung from, catching the first light the way it did every morning on Maple Ridge Drive. Ruth Engelman waved from her porch next door. Donald Pratt nodded from his driveway. The street was quiet again. But something had changed. Not the street. The street looked the same as it always had. What changed was what people now understood could happen on it. Clarence began speaking publicly in the months that followed. Not on cable news panels or viral clips, but in the rooms where it mattered. Police academies, congressional briefings, community forums in cities where families like his had stories that never made the news. He told his story the same way every time. Not with anger, not with bitterness, with precision. The same precision he had brought to 34 years behind the badge. "I wore a badge for 34 years, he would say. I know what it's supposed to mean. I know the weight of it. And I know exactly what it looks like when someone forgets." Victor Stelling was last seen leaving a federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta 3 months after his termination. No cameras followed him, no reporters called his name. The career he had built on instinct and impunity was gone, replaced by a case number and a court date. His name now appeared in training manuals distributed across DHS field offices nationally, cited as a case study in what unchecked authority and racial bias produce when no one is held accountable, until someone finally is. A training bulletin circulated through every ICE field office in the country that fall. It showed a single still frame pulled from Donald Pratt's video. A black man in a bathrobe, hands cuffed behind his back, pressed against his own truck in his own driveway. An American flag hanging in the background. Beneath the image, 2 lines in bold type. This is what failure looks like. No names were printed. They didn't need to be, because the careers were already gone. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.
Step away from the truck! Hands up, now!
I live here. What's this about?
Don't lie to me. We know who you are.
My name is Elijah Drummond. I'm a U.S. citizen.
Yeah, that's what you all say when you get caught!
You're on my injury. I'm not resisting.
What's going on over there?
At 6:42 a.m. on a quiet residential street in Columbus, Georgia, 3 unmarked black SUVs blocked the driveway of a single-story brick home with an American flag hanging from the porch. 6 ICE agents in full tactical gear surrounded a black man in gym shorts and a faded Army t-shirt as he loaded a toolbox into the bed of his pickup truck for work. Before he could turn around, 2 agents grabbed him by the arms, forced him face down onto his own concrete driveway, and zip-tied his wrists behind his back. They were shouting about a deportation warrant. The man was Staff Sergeant Elijah Drummond, retired, a United States citizen born 38 years ago in the same city where his face was now pressed into the pavement. He was a Purple Heart recipient, a 2-tour combat veteran who had taken shrapnel in Fallujah, protecting the same flag now stitched onto the sleeves of the men pinning him down. The agents had no judicial warrant, no criminal warrant, no arrest order with his name on it. They had the wrong address, the wrong target, and the wrong man. And standing at the screen door 6 feet away, watching her father held to the ground by armed strangers, was his 7-year-old daughter Nyla, screaming so loudly the neighbors could hear it from inside their homes. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because the next story is one you don't want to miss. Elijah Drummond had lived in Columbus his entire life. He grew up on the South Side, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at the textile plant. He was quiet, disciplined, and built for structure. He enlisted in the United States Army at 18, the day after his high school graduation. Infantry. He shipped out within months and never looked back. Over the next 14 years, Elijah rose through the ranks on 2 combat deployments, first to Iraq and then to Afghanistan. He earned his promotions the hard way, in firefights and field operations, where decisions were made in seconds and mistakes were measured in bodies. It was during his second tour in Fallujah that an IED detonated beneath his convoy. The blast killed 2 members of his squad instantly. Elijah survived with a titanium plate in his left leg and partial hearing loss in his right ear. For his actions that day, the Army awarded him the Purple Heart. He came home with an honorable discharge, a box of commendations, and a body that reminded him every morning of what he had given. He settled back in Columbus, took a job as a licensed electrician, married a woman named Simone, and built a life that was small and steady. When Simone was diagnosed with cancer, he cared for her until the end. That was 2 years ago. Since then, Elijah had raised Nyla on his own. He braided her hair before school. He coached Little League on Saturdays. He went to work, came home, and kept his house clean. He was respected on his block, known by name at the hardware store, and never once asked the world to notice what he had sacrificed. He was the kind of man who gave everything and expected nothing in return. And on that Tuesday morning, his country repaid him by putting his face on his own driveway and making his daughter watch. The lead agent was Supervisory Deportation Officer Vincent Taggart, 44 years old, 16 years with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He had built his career on volume. His unit ran more enforcement operations per quarter than any other in the southeastern region, a number his supervisors praised in performance reviews without ever asking how it was achieved. The answer was speed. Taggart's teams moved fast, verified little, and relied on instinct over paperwork. Among field agents, he was known as a closer. Among immigration attorneys and civil rights groups, he was known as something else entirely. Over the course of his career, 7 formal complaints had been filed against Taggart for rights violations, including 2 wrongful detentions of U.S. citizens, one involving a 63-year-old Puerto Rican grandmother held for 11 hours before anyone confirmed her citizenship. Every complaint had been administratively cleared. No discipline, no retraining, no record that followed him into his next operation. His second that morning was Field Agent Brent Nolan, 31, 4 years on the job. Nolan had joined ICE straight out of a criminal justice program and landed under Taggart's supervision within his first year. He learned quickly what was rewarded and what wasn't. Taggart liked agents who moved when he moved, talked when he talked, and never questioned a call in the field. Nolan became that agent. He mirrored Taggart's aggression because it earned approval, and he stayed silent when things went wrong because that earned even more. That morning, the team had been dispatched to execute an administrative deportation warrant for a Guatemalan national named Carlos Mejia Solano. The target address was 412 Birchwood Lane. Elijah Drummond lived at 414 Magnolia Drive, 2 blocks south. The names didn't match. The addresses didn't match. But Taggart never verified either one. He saw a black man outside a house in the general vicinity and decided that was close enough. Taggart reached Elijah before he even had time to set the toolbox down. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands where I can see them." Elijah turned slowly, palms open, arms at his sides. "I live here. What's going on?" 2 agents flanked him immediately. A third stood near the truck bed, hand on his holster. Taggart didn't answer the question. "Are you Carlos Mejia Solano?" Elijah's brow furrowed. "Number. My name is Elijah Drummond. I'm a U.S. citizen. This is my house." Taggart stepped closer. "We have a warrant. Turn around." Elijah kept his voice steady. "Sir, my ID is inside the house. My daughter is right there. Let me show you who I am." Taggart glanced at the screen door where Nyla stood in her pajamas, eyes wide, hands pressed to the mesh. He looked back at Elijah without acknowledging her. "Turn around. Now." Elijah complied. He placed his hands behind his back slowly, deliberately, the same way he had been trained to move in situations where one wrong gesture could change everything. 2 agents grabbed his arms and forced him down. His knees hit the concrete first, then his chest, then the side of his face. The impact reopened a scar above his left eyebrow. Zip ties were cinched around his wrists so tightly the plastic cut into his skin within seconds. Then Nolan knelt on his back. The knee landed directly on the lower left side, exactly where the shrapnel had torn through muscle and tissue 14 years earlier in Fallujah. Elijah's breath left him in a sharp gasp. "I have a combat injury. You're on my wound. Please move your knee." Nolan pressed harder. "Stop talking." Elijah gritted his teeth, face against the pavement, eyes squeezed shut. "I'm not resisting. I'm telling you, I'm injured." "Shut up," Nolan said. Across the street, a door opened. Gwendolyn Price, 68 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, stepped onto her porch in a bathrobe. She saw the SUVs, the tactical gear, and Elijah face down on his own driveway. She went back inside, came out with her phone, and began recording without saying a word. 2 houses down, Franklin Osei watched from his front window, then picked up his phone and dialed 911. "There are armed men in tactical gear on my neighbor's driveway. They've got him on the ground. I don't know who they are. There's no marked vehicles. Please send someone." And through it all, Nyla stood at the screen door, crying, calling out the only word that mattered. "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." Not one agent turned to look at her. Taggart stood over Elijah and keyed his radio. "Dispatch, confirm physical description on target Mejia Solano." There was a pause, then the dispatcher's voice came back flat and clear. "Target is male, 5'6", approximately 140 pounds, age 27. Taggart looked down at Elijah. Elijah was 6'2", over 200 pounds, and 38 years old. The name was wrong. The height was wrong. The age was wrong. Everything was wrong. Taggart released the radio button and said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to Nolan, who still had his knee on Elijah's back. "Keep him restrained. We're sorting this out." Elijah spoke through clenched teeth. "There's nothing to sort out. My name is on the mailbox. My ID is inside the front door. You have the wrong person." Taggart didn't respond. A third agent, one of the younger members of the team, walked toward the house and stopped at the screen door. Nyla was still standing there, tears running down her face, her small hands flat against the mesh. The agent looked at her for a moment, then turned and walked back toward the SUVs without a word. He didn't speak to her, didn't tell her it was going to be okay, didn't call for anyone to come be with her. He just left a 7-year-old girl standing alone behind a door, watching her father bleed on the concrete. From across the street, Gwendolyn Price raised her voice for the first time. "That man is a veteran. He's lived in that house for years. You have the wrong person." Taggart turned toward her porch. His expression didn't change. "Ma'am, we determine who's who, not you. A lot of people claim things they're not." The words carried clearly across the morning air. Gwendolyn's phone caught every syllable. So did the Ring doorbell camera mounted on Franklin Osei's front door directly across the street, recording in high definition with a timestamp in the corner of the frame. Gwendolyn didn't lower her phone. She didn't go back inside. She stood on her porch in her bathrobe and kept recording. Because she had spent 30 years teaching children the difference between right and wrong, and she knew exactly which one she was looking at. The first Columbus PD cruiser arrived 7 minutes after Franklin's 911 call. Officer Janelle Sutton stepped out, assessed the scene quickly, 3 unmarked SUVs, 6 agents in tactical gear, a man face down on a residential driveway, and a child visible through the screen door of the home. She approached with her hand near her radio, not her weapon. Then she saw his face. She stopped walking. "That's Sergeant Drummond." Her voice was sharp, immediate, and certain. Her 12-year-old son Caleb played shortstop on the Little League team Elijah coached every Saturday at Linden Park. She had watched Elijah run drills with those kids for 2 seasons. She had spoken to him at games, at team cookouts, at the end-of-year award ceremony. She knew exactly who he was. She turned to Taggart. "That man is a United States citizen. He was born in this city. He's a combat veteran. What are you doing?" Taggart straightened. "We're federal agents executing a lawful operation. Step back, officer." Sutton didn't move. She looked at Elijah's face, the blood above his eyebrow, the zip ties cutting into his wrists, the swelling along his left side where Nolan's knee had been pressing for nearly 15 minutes. She keyed her radio. "Sergeant Covington, this is Sutton at Magnolia Drive. I need a supervisor here now. We have federal agents detaining a U.S. citizen." Wrong target, wrong address, possible excessive force. Sergeant Ray Covington arrived 4 minutes later in an unmarked sedan. He walked directly to Taggart and extended his hand. "Let me see the warrant." Taggart hesitated, then handed it over. Covington read it once, then looked up. "This warrant is for Carlos Mejia Solano at 412 Birchwood Lane. This is 414 Magnolia Drive. The man on the ground is not your target. He's not even in your system. You have the wrong man at the wrong house. Release him. Now." Taggart didn't move immediately. He looked at Nolan. He looked at the other agents standing near the SUVs. He looked at Gwendolyn, still recording from her porch. At the neighbors now gathered on the sidewalk. At Sutton standing between him and the house, with her body camera blinking red. 11 minutes passed. 11 minutes in which a man whose citizenship, identity, and address had all been confirmed remained face down on his own property in zip ties. Then finally, Taggart pulled a blade from his vest and cut the ties. He didn't say a word. No apology, no explanation. He just cut the plastic and stepped back, as if releasing Elijah erased everything that had happened in the 23 minutes before it. Elijah stood slowly. It took him 3 attempts. His left leg, the one carrying 14 years of titanium and scar tissue, buckled twice before it held. The knee pressure from Nolan had driven directly into the old wound, and the pain radiated from his hip to his ankle in sharp, pulsing waves. His face was scraped raw on the right side where the concrete had ground into his skin. A cut above his left eyebrow had bled down past his jaw and onto the collar of his army t-shirt, which was torn at the shoulder seam. Both wrists were lined with deep red grooves from the zip ties, the skin broken in 2 places, blood already drying in thin streaks across his palms. He flexed his right arm and winced. His shoulder had been wrenched during the takedown and now hung slightly lower than the other. He stood there on his own driveway, surrounded by his own neighbors, in front of his own home, bleeding from wounds inflicted by men who had never once confirmed his name. The screen door flew open. Nyla ran to him barefoot across the concrete and wrapped both arms around his waist, pressing her face into his stomach, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. Elijah brought one arm around her and held her close. The other arm hung at his side because he could barely lift it. He didn't say a word. He just rested his chin on top of her head and closed his eyes. Gwendolyn crossed the street with tears streaming down her face. Franklin stood at the edge of the driveway, fists clenched, jaw tight. Other neighbors gathered on the sidewalk in bathrobes and work clothes, some holding coffee, some holding phones, all of them silent. Elijah's toolbox lay overturned near the truck bed, tools scattered across the driveway. His truck door was still open, the engine cold. He didn't look at the agents, didn't speak to them, didn't ask for an explanation or an apology. He just held his daughter. Officer Sutton approached quietly and stood a few feet away until Elijah opened his eyes. "Sergeant Drummond, I'm going to make sure every piece of this is documented. My body camera has been running since I arrived." She paused. "I'm sorry this happened to you." Elijah nodded once, but said nothing. Across the street, mounted beneath the eave of Franklin O'Sea's front porch, a Ring doorbell camera had recorded the entire encounter from start to finish. 23 minutes of uninterrupted footage. Every agent, every order, every second Nyla spent screaming behind that screen door. It had captured all of it, and it was already saved to the cloud. Gwendolyn Price uploaded her phone video at 9:14 that morning. She posted it without commentary, just a 12-minute clip titled, "They did this to a veteran on his own driveway." Franklin O'Sea uploaded the Ring footage an hour later, all 23 minutes, time-stamped and unedited. By noon, both videos had been shared thousands of times. By 3 p.m., a veterans advocacy page with over 2 million followers reposted the Ring footage with a single caption: "Purple Heart recipient, U.S.-born citizen, wrong address, wrong man, no apology." The clip exploded. By evening, the combined views crossed 2 million. By the next morning, they had passed 6. The image that defined the story wasn't the takedown or the knee on his back. It was a single frame from the Ring camera, pulled and screenshotted by thousands of people independently, as if they had all recognized the same unbearable detail at the same moment. In the frame, Elijah lay face down on the concrete, arms zip-tied behind his back, blood visible on his forehead. Behind him, the front door of his home was slightly ajar, and hanging from a bracket on the porch, directly above the scene, was an American flag, still and limp in the windless morning air. That image spread faster than the video itself. Veterans organizations issued furious public statements. 3 congressional offices released responses before lunch. Civil rights attorneys began calling Elijah's phone, leaving voicemails offering representation. Local news led with the story at 5 and 6. National outlets picked it up by the following morning. Anchors described the footage. Legal analysts broke down the Fourth Amendment violations. Retired military officers went on camera and said what millions were already thinking. He bled for this country, and this country sent armed men to his driveway who didn't even bother to check his name. And in a quiet office inside ICE's Southeastern Field headquarters, someone pulled up the Ring footage on a government computer, watched the first 4 minutes, and immediately forwarded it to the regional director with a single line in the email. "We have a serious problem." ICE headquarters in Washington released a statement at 4:47 p.m. the following day, nearly 32 hours after the arrest. It was 3 sentences long. The statement described the incident as a procedural discrepancy during a routine enforcement action and said the agency was conducting an internal review. It concluded by affirming that all agents involved had followed standard operational protocol. There was no mention of Elijah's name, no mention of his military service, no mention of Nyla, no acknowledgement that the warrant had been for a different person at a different address. The statement read like it had been drafted by someone who had never watched the footage, or, more likely, by someone who had watched every second of it and understood exactly how much needed to be buried. That same day, Taggart filed his official incident report. In it, he described Elijah as initially uncooperative and stated that the subject failed to comply with verbal commands, necessitating physical restraint. He wrote that force used was proportional to the circumstances and consistent with field protocol for high-risk enforcement operations. Nolan filed his report the following morning. It echoed Taggart's nearly word for word, same phrasing, same structure, same calculated omissions. Neither report mentioned that the dispatcher had read back a physical description that didn't match Elijah. Neither mentioned Gwendolyn's repeated attempts to tell them they had the wrong man. Neither mentioned Nyla standing at the screen door. Neither mentioned the 11 minutes Taggart waited after Sergeant Covington told them to release Elijah. But the videos told a completely different story, and by that point, millions of people had already seen them. Within 48 hours, congressional inquiries began flooding into the Department of Homeland Security. 12 members of the House, 4 senators, and the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus demanded a formal review. The DHS Office of Inspector General opened an investigation. The IG team moved quickly. They pulled GPS logs from all 3 SUVs, confirming the vehicles had never been within 2 blocks of the correct target address. They pulled radio transcripts and found the dispatch correction Taggart had received and acknowledged 7 minutes into the encounter, a correction he never acted on for another 10 minutes. Then they pulled Taggart's phone. In his text messages, sent to a colleague 40 minutes after Elijah was released, was a single line that would later be read aloud in a federal courtroom. Got the wrong one, but he was acting like he had something to hide anyway. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opened its own parallel investigation 9 days after the arrest. The lead was a senior trial attorney from the criminal section, supported by 2 FBI agents and a federal civil rights analyst. They were not there to review policy. They were there to determine whether federal crimes had been committed. Their first interview was with Elijah. He arrived in a pressed shirt, a folder of documents under his arm, and gave his statement with the same precision he had once used to deliver field reports under fire. He provided timestamps down to the minute. He recalled exact phrases, who said what and when. He described the location of each agent on the driveway, the angle of his body when he was taken down, the point of contact where Nolan's knee met his shrapnel wound. He described Nyla's position at the screen door and the moment the third agent looked at her and walked away without speaking. He did not raise his voice. He did not editorialize. He delivered the facts like a man who had spent his life in environments where facts were the difference between living and dying. The investigators then interviewed Gwendolyn Price, whose video had become the most viewed clip associated with the case. She described what she saw from her porch and repeated Taggart's words exactly. A lot of people claim things they're not. Franklin Osei provided the ring footage directly from his cloud account and confirmed the timestamps. Officer Janelle Sutton gave a detailed statement corroborated by her own body camera footage. 6 additional neighbors provided statements, all consistent, all describing the same sequence of events from different vantage points. Then the investigators subpoenaed ICE internal records. What they found went far beyond one morning in Columbus. Taggart's unit had accumulated 14 formal complaints of wrongful detention in just 3 years. The targets were disproportionately Black and Latino U.S. citizens and legal residents. 7 of the 14 complaints involved operations conducted at addresses that did not match the warrants being executed. In each case, the agents had detained individuals based on proximity and appearance rather than verified identity. Not one of the 14 complaints had resulted in discipline. Not a single reprimand. Not a single retraining order. Not a single suspension. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not a one-time mistake made by a careless agent on a Tuesday morning. This was an institutional failure, built on speed, protected by silence, and enabled by a system that treated zero accountability as standard operating procedure. Elijah chose his attorney carefully. He didn't go with the first name on the list or the loudest voice in his voicemail. He chose Constance Adeyemi, a former federal prosecutor who had spent 8 years inside the Department of Justice before leaving to represent the people the government failed. She had built a reputation on cases no one else wanted to touch, suing federal agencies, challenging qualified immunity, and winning settlements that came with structural reform attached. She didn't take cases for headlines. She took them for precedent. When she sat down with Elijah for the first time, she listened for 2 hours without interrupting. Then, she told him what she intended to do. Within 3 weeks, Adeyemi filed a federal civil rights lawsuit in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Georgia. The defendants named were Supervisory Deportation Officer Vincent Taggart, Field Agent Brent Nolan, 4 additional agents present on the driveway that morning, the director of ICE's Southeastern Field Office, and the Department of Homeland Security itself. The complaint ran 47 pages. It alleged unlawful arrest without probable cause, excessive force in violation of the Fourth Amendment, racial profiling, intentional infliction of emotional distress on both Elijah and his minor daughter, and negligent supervision by the field office and DHS for failing to discipline or retrain agents with documented histories of civil rights violations. Adeyemi subpoenaed Taggart's full disciplinary file. What came back confirmed what the DOJ investigation had already begun to uncover, but in sharper, more damning detail. The 7 prior complaints were laid out in full. One involved a 24-year-old Latino legal resident detained during a workplace raid despite presenting a valid green card. Another described a black mother of 3 pulled from her vehicle at a gas station while her children sat in the back seat. Agents held her for 45 minutes before confirming she was a U.S. citizen. But the worst was a case from 2 years earlier. A 70-year-old black man named Cornelius Beckett, a retired postal worker and U.S. citizen born in Macon, Georgia, was picked up during an enforcement sweep outside a bus station. He was transported to a federal detention facility 90 miles away. He told every person who would listen that he was an American citizen. No one checked for 9 hours. When they finally ran his information, they confirmed he was exactly who he said he was. He was released without explanation. The complaint on that case had been reviewed and closed with 3 words written at the bottom of the file: no action required. Adeyemi included every word of that case in her filing. She wanted the court to see not just what happened to Elijah Drummond, but what had been allowed to happen to others before him, and what would keep happening if no one was held accountable. The case reached Congress 5 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. The House Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship announced a formal hearing on ICE enforcement practices, and Elijah Drummond was invited to testify. He arrived in Washington on a Tuesday morning wearing a dark suit, a pressed white shirt, and his Purple Heart pinned to his left lapel. He sat at a long wooden table facing the committee, a microphone in front of him, cameras behind him, and a room full of staffers, reporters, and spectators watching from every seat. He did not bring prepared remarks. He spoke from memory, the way he had given field reports for 14 years. He described the morning simply and completely: the toolbox, the SUVs, the agents, the orders, the takedown. He described the concrete against his face and the zip ties cutting into his wrists. He described the knee on his shrapnel wound and the way his vision blurred from the pain. He described asking them to check his ID and being told to shut up. Then he paused. He looked directly into the camera and described his daughter. He described Nyla standing at the screen door in her pajamas. He described the sound of her screaming for him while armed men held him on the ground. He described the agent who walked to the door, looked at her, and turned away without a word. The room was silent. No one moved. No one typed. Then Elijah said, "I bled for this country in Fallujah. I left pieces of myself in the sand so that families like mine could be safe at home. And I came home, and this country sent armed men to my driveway to treat me like I didn't belong here. Like I wasn't American enough. Like my citizenship needed to be earned twice because of the color of my skin." A committee member turned to the acting ICE director, seated at a separate table across the room. How was this allowed to happen? The director adjusted his microphone. He spoke about operational protocols, about ongoing internal reviews, about the agency's commitment to accountability and professionalism. He used the phrase "standard procedure" 3 times. He did not say Elijah's name. He did not mention Nyla. He did not answer the question. Clips of Elijah's testimony were posted online within the hour. By evening, they had been viewed over 8 million times. The image of a Purple Heart veteran sitting calmly before Congress, describing how his own government treated him like a criminal in front of his child, became the second defining frame of the case. The first was the flag above the driveway. The second was the medal on his chest. And neither one could be explained away. The federal grand jury returned indictments 6 weeks after the DOJ investigation concluded. Supervisory Deportation Officer Vincent Taggart was charged with 2 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law, under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, and 1 count of filing false statements in a federal report. Field Agent Brent Nolan was charged with 1 count of deprivation of rights and 1 count of accessory to false reporting. Both men were arrested on the same morning, Taggart at his home in Hinesville, Nolan at his apartment in Savannah. They were processed, fingerprinted, and released on bond. Neither spoke to the press. Within a week, the director of ICE's Southeastern Field Office submitted his resignation. No public statement accompanied it, no press conference, no acknowledgement of what had happened under his authority. He simply stepped down and disappeared from the agency directory, as if removing his name could separate him from the 14 complaints, the 7 wrong addresses, and the culture of zero oversight he had allowed to metastasize inside his operation. 3 additional agents from Taggart's unit were placed on indefinite, unpaid suspension, pending further review of their involvement in prior wrongful detentions. Their access credentials were revoked. Their service weapons were collected. Taggart's trial began on a Monday in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Georgia. It lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution opened with the ring footage. 23 minutes of uninterrupted video played on a screen mounted above the jury box. The jurors watched Elijah taken to the ground. They watched Nolan's knee press into his back. They watched Nyla standing behind the screen door, her mouth open, her hands flat against the mesh. They heard every word. Then the prosecution played Gwendolyn's phone video, which captured Taggart's voice clearly. A lot of people claim things they're not. They played the radio transcript in which the dispatcher read back a description that matched nothing about Elijah, and Taggart acknowledged it. Then they entered the text message into evidence. Got the wrong one, but he was acting like he had something to hide anyway. The defense argued it was an honest mistake, a high-pressure operation, a regrettable error in the fog of field enforcement. The attorney described Taggart as a dedicated public servant with 16 years of experience who made a split-second judgment call. He asked the jury to consider the difficulty of the work, the danger of enforcement operations, and the impossibility of perfection. The prosecution responded by replaying the 11 minutes Taggart waited after being told to release Elijah. 11 minutes after a Columbus PD supervisor stood in front of him, holding the wrong warrant, and said plainly that the man on the ground was not the man they were looking for. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned guilty on all counts. Taggart was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison. The judge noted the flagrant disregard for a citizen's constitutional rights, the physical harm inflicted on a decorated combat veteran, and the emotional trauma caused to a minor child who watched her father brutalized from inside her own home. Nolan received 14 months. The judge described him as a willing participant who chose obedience over conscience and silence over intervention. Both men were permanently barred from federal law enforcement. Their credentials were revoked. Their names were entered into the National Decertification Index. Neither would carry a badge again. The civil lawsuit settled 4 months before it was scheduled to go to trial. Constance Adeyemi had built a case so thoroughly documented and so publicly visible that the Department of Homeland Security's attorneys had no room to maneuver. The video evidence alone was devastating. Combined with the disciplinary records, the dispatcher transcripts, the text message, and the testimony of 9 witnesses, the government's legal team understood that a jury trial would not produce a more favorable outcome than what was already on the table. DHS agreed to a settlement of $4.2 million, one of the largest individual payouts in an ICE wrongful arrest case in the agency's history. The money was significant, but Adeyemi had made clear from the beginning that a check alone was not acceptable. The settlement included a binding set of structural reforms imposed on ICE's Southeastern Field Office and recommended for adoption agency-wide. Mandatory address and identity verification protocols were required before any enforcement action could be initiated. No agent could approach a target location without confirmed cross-referencing of the warrant name, physical description, and address against at least 2 independent databases. An independent review process was established for all complaints involving U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents, removing the authority of field office supervisors to close complaints without external oversight. Quarterly public reporting on wrongful detentions was mandated, including demographic data on the individuals affected. And a civilian oversight board was created for the regional field office, with the authority to review operations, access complaint files, and issue binding recommendations. Elijah sat in Adeyemi's office the day the settlement was finalized. He read every page. He signed where he needed to sign. Then he told her what he wanted to do with a portion of the money. He established a legal defense fund for U.S. citizens and lawful residents wrongfully targeted by immigration enforcement. People who didn't have cameras rolling, didn't have neighbors willing to record, didn't have a decorated military record to force the system to pay attention. The fund would connect them with attorneys, cover legal costs, and ensure their cases didn't vanish into the same administrative silence that had swallowed the 14 complaints before his. He named the fund after his late wife, the Simone Drummond Justice Fund, because she had believed, even when the world gave her every reason not to, that doing the right thing still mattered. Elijah went back to work 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized. He loaded his toolbox into the same truck, drove to the same job sites, and pulled wire through the same walls he had been pulling wire through for years. He picked Nyla up from school at 3:15 every afternoon. He coached Little League on Saturdays at Linden Park, running the same drills, standing behind the same backstop, clapping for the same kids who didn't know or care what had happened on his driveway. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write a book. He didn't go on tour. He went back to the life he had built because that life was the whole point. The only visible change was the driveway. He had it repaved 2 weeks after the settlement. Smooth concrete, no cracks, no scuff marks, no blood-stained patch where his face had been pressed into the ground. He didn't do it for himself. He did it because Nyla walked across that driveway every morning on her way to the school bus, and he didn't want her to look down and remember. Gwendolyn Price still lived across the street. She still waved to Elijah every morning when he loaded his truck. On her refrigerator, held up by a magnet from her church, was a printed screenshot of the moment her video passed 1 million views. She never posted another video in her life. She didn't need to. She had done what needed doing when it needed doing, and that was enough. Officer Janelle Sutton received a formal commendation from the Columbus Police Department for her intervention that morning. Her sergeant wrote in the citation that her actions represented the highest standards of professional conduct and community trust. She never spoke publicly about the case, but at the next Little League game, she sat in the bleachers behind home plate and watched her son take the field, coached by the same man she had found face down on his own property, and she knew exactly what her badge was supposed to mean. Vincent Taggart served his 30-month sentence at a federal correctional facility in Jessup, Georgia. His former profession earned him no respect inside those walls. He kept to himself, filed no appeals, and made no public statements. When he was released, he left the state. His name returned nothing in law enforcement databases except a revoked credential and a case number. Brent Nolan served 14 months at a minimum security facility in Montgomery, Alabama. After his release, he left law enforcement entirely. He never applied for another badge. He moved to a small town in North Florida where no one knew his name and no one had seen the video. The ICE Southeastern Field Office underwent a full restructuring in the year following the settlement. New leadership was installed. Verification protocols were implemented. The Civilian Oversight Board held its first meeting 60 days after the agreement was signed. Complaint files that had been closed without action were reopened and reassigned to independent reviewers. Quietly, without ceremony, a training bulletin began circulating through DHS offices nationwide. It was one page. At the top was a still frame pulled from Franklin Osei's Ring camera. In the image, a man lay face down on a concrete driveway, wrists bound behind his back. Through the open front door of the house behind him, the edge of a framed Purple Heart certificate was visible on the hallway wall. And in the screen door, backlit by the glow of a kitchen light, was the silhouette of a small child, hands pressed to the mesh. Beneath the image, in plain black text, were 9 words. Verify before you act. This is what failure costs. No names were printed. They didn't need to be. The careers were already gone. Elijah Drummond never spoke publicly about the case again. He didn't need to. The footage spoke for itself. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, a lot of you have told me you're waking up at 2 or 3 a.m. and just lying there, can't shut your mind off, and the next day you're dragging through everything. I came across a simple 21-day sleep guide that's helped thousands of people fix exactly that. No pills, no apps, no gadgets. Just a step-by-step plan that actually works. It's only $15. I put the link in the description if you want to check it out. All right, I'll catch you in the next one.